The worst mistake of my life wasn't dropping a silver tray in front of Manhattan's elite. It was standing in the exact place where destiny could finally see me. My name is Emily Carter, and 3 months ago, I was just a maid trying to survive. 24 years old. 2 part-time jobs. A stack of medical bills for my younger brother that seemed to grow taller every week. I spent my mornings cleaning offices downtown and my evenings working at the Moretti estate, one of the largest private homes on the Upper East Side. Most days, nobody noticed me. That was fine. Invisible people made fewer mistakes. At least, that's what I used to believe. The night everything changed began with rain tapping softly against the mansion's towering windows. The annual Moretti Foundation Gala was only an hour away. Caterers rushed through hallways carrying trays of food worth more than my weekly paycheck. Florists adjusted arrangements taller than I was. Security personnel moved quietly through every room, speaking into hidden earpieces. The entire house felt like it was holding its breath. I was carrying a polished silver tray through the grand ballroom when my shoe caught the edge of a decorative rug. 1 second, everything was balanced. The next, I heard the metallic crash echo through the room. Silver pitchers rolled across marble floors. Crystal glasses shattered into glittering fragments. Every head turned toward me. My stomach dropped. "Emily," the head housekeeper whispered sharply. "Not tonight." Heat rushed into my face. I immediately dropped to my knees, trying to gather the scattered pieces before anyone important arrived. My hands trembled. This job paid nearly double what most housekeeping positions offered. I couldn't afford to lose it. "Leave the glass," a gentle voice said. "You'll cut yourself." I looked up. Margaret Moretti stood beside me. Even at 63, she carried herself with quiet elegance. Unlike most wealthy people I served, she always looked directly at me when she spoke, like I existed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moretti," I said quickly. "It was an accident." "Of course it was," she replied with a small smile. "Only villains make mistakes on purpose." "Hey." Few nearby staff members laughed softly. My shoulders relaxed for the first time all evening. Margaret offered me a hand and helped me stand. Nobody had ever done that before. Not in this house. Not anywhere. "Thank you," I whispered. "You're welcome, child." Child. Not maid. Not staff. Not girl. Child. The words settled somewhere deep inside me. Before I could respond, the front doors opened. Conversations immediately shifted. Guests began arriving. Men in tailored tuxedos. Women wearing diamonds that sparkled beneath the chandeliers like captured stars. The room transformed in seconds. Wealth, power, influence. It all poured through those doors. I stepped back into my role and resumed working. Smile. Serve. Stay invisible. That was the plan. Then she arrived. Vanessa Whitmore entered the ballroom, surrounded by attention the way some people carried perfume. Her designer gown swept across the marble floor. Cameras flashed near the entrance. She smiled for them effortlessly. Beautiful, confident, untouchable. At least, that's how she wanted everyone to see her. As she passed me, her eyes briefly scanned my uniform. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of look that reminded people exactly where they stood. And somehow, standing there beneath the golden light of the chandeliers, I had this sudden feeling that my night was about to get much worse. I should have listened to that feeling. The one twisting quietly in my stomach as Vanessa Whitmore crossed the ballroom beneath a storm of camera flashes and practiced smiles. Some people entered a room and brought warmth with them. Others carried tension like a shadow. Vanessa carried certainty. The certainty that every person around her existed somewhere below her. I lowered my eyes and continued arranging champagne glasses on a serving station near the ballroom wall. That was another lesson life had taught me. People with power usually lost interest if you gave them nothing to focus on. Unfortunately, Vanessa seemed interested anyway. 20 minutes later, guests filled every corner of the mansion. A string quartet played softly beneath crystal chandeliers. Laughter drifted through the room. Waiters moved between clusters of investors, politicians, and celebrities. The entire evening looked perfect from the outside. Then I heard my name. Emily. My shoulders stiffened instantly. Vanessa stood 10 feet away, holding an empty champagne flute. Several guests surrounded her. "Yes, Miss Whitmore?" I asked politely. She examined the glass before handing it to me. "Another." I accepted it. "Of course." I turned toward the refreshment station. "Actually," she said. "Wait." I stopped. Her smile widened. I have a question. A few nearby guests became noticeably quieter. How many things have you dropped tonight? My face warmed immediately. I am sorry about earlier. That was not an answer. Soft laughter followed. Not cruel laughter. Uncomfortable laughter. The kind people used when they wanted to stay on the right side of someone important. I forced a smile. Only the tray. Only the tray, she repeated dramatically. Well, that is reassuring. More laughter. I focused on breathing. One inhale. One exhale. Just get through the night. You should be grateful, Vanessa continued. Most employers would not keep someone so clumsy. I heard a few people shift awkwardly nearby. Even they knew she was pushing too far. But nobody interrupted her. Nobody except one person. That is enough. Margaret Moretti's voice was calm, firm. The room immediately grew quieter. Vanessa turned toward her. Excuse me. Margaret stepped closer. The young woman made a mistake. She apologized. Let it go. Vanessa's smile faded slightly. I was only joking. Good jokes make everyone laugh, Margaret replied. Not just the person telling them. A silence settled between them. I suddenly wished I could disappear completely. Margaret was defending me, and somehow that felt worse. Because now Vanessa looked genuinely annoyed. You are very kind, Margaret, she said carefully. Perhaps too kind. Margaret smiled politely. Kindness costs less than cruelty. Several guests exchanged glances. I could practically feel the tension spreading through the ballroom. Vanessa's expression hardened for only a second before her social mask returned. But I saw it. The irritation. The embarrassment. The need to regain control. Emily, she said suddenly. Since you are standing here doing nothing, perhaps you can clean my shoes. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. I am sorry. My heel picked up water outside. She extended one designer shoe slightly forward. You work here. Do your job. My heart dropped. The surrounding conversations died completely. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye seemed fixed on the scene unfolding beneath the chandeliers. I looked at the floor, then at the shoe, then at Margaret. Margaret's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind that carried far more weight. She will do no such thing, Margaret said quietly. Vanessa turned toward her again. This time, the smile disappeared completely. And for the first time that night, I had the unmistakable feeling that something far bigger than a simple argument was about to happen. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop several degrees. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody moved. Yet somehow the entire room felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Vanessa stared at Margaret Moretti with a smile that no longer reached her eyes. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. I was simply asking an employee to perform her duties. Margaret remained calm. Humiliating someone is not a duty. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that came from a woman who had spent decades being respected instead of feared. Vanessa laughed once. A short, sharp sound. You are defending a maid. I am defending a person, Margaret replied. Around us, guests pretended to focus on their drinks, their conversations, their phones. None of them succeeded. Everyone was listening. I wish they were not. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. This is unnecessary, I said quietly. Please. I can go. Margaret immediately shook her head. No, child. Child. She used that word again. And somehow that simple kindness seemed to irritate Vanessa even more. Interesting, Vanessa said. Very interesting. She took a slow step forward. Do you know what people are saying tonight? Margaret looked at her patiently. I cannot imagine. They are saying your family has become soft. A few nearby guests visibly stiffened. Even I knew that was not the kind of statement people usually made in public. Margaret showed no reaction. People say many things. Perhaps they are right. Vanessa folded her arms. Perhaps that is why others are starting to question the future of the Moretti Empire. The room became completely silent. I did not understand enough about high society to know every implication behind those words, but I understood enough to recognize a challenge when I heard one. Margaret's expression never changed. You seem very concerned about our future. Someone should be. The exchange felt less like an argument and more like a chess match. Every sentence carefully chosen. Every smile hiding something sharper underneath. I slowly backed away, hoping nobody would notice. Then Vanessa looked directly at me again. You. My stomach sank. Yes, Miss Whitmore. Come here. I froze. Every instinct told me not to move. But refusing would only make things worse. I stepped forward. Tell everyone what happened earlier. I dropped a tray. Because. I blinked. I am sorry. Because you were careless. Her voice remained perfectly pleasant. Say it. Heat crept into my face. I made a mistake. Louder. My fingers tightened around the serving cloth in my hand. I made a mistake. Vanessa nodded as though proving a point. Exactly. People fail because they make poor choices. Margaret stepped forward immediately. That is enough. Vanessa's eyes flashed. You keep interrupting me. Because you keep forgetting your manners. Several guests inhaled sharply. For the first time all evening, Vanessa looked genuinely embarrassed. Not because of me. Because Margaret had corrected her publicly. I saw it happen. The exact moment pride took control. Her smile vanished completely. Her posture stiffened. The carefully polished social mask cracked. Only for a second, but it was enough. And standing there beneath the glow of 100 crystal lights, I suddenly realized this was no longer about me. It was no longer about a dropped tray or a pair of shoes. Something much deeper was happening between them. Something old. Something personal. And whatever came next was going to change the entire night. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the faint clink of ice inside someone's glass across the ballroom. Nobody seemed willing to breathe first. Vanessa Whitmore stood perfectly still, but the tension radiating from her was impossible to miss. Margaret Moretti remained calm, composed, unshaken. Looking back now, that was probably what made the difference. People like Vanessa expected resistance. They knew how to fight anger. They knew how to respond to insults. What they could not stand was someone who refused to be intimidated. You seem to think this house belongs to you, Margaret said quietly. Vanessa gave a short laugh. Of course not. Then perhaps you should remember whose guests we all are tonight. A few people lowered their eyes. Others suddenly became very interested in their drinks. The message had been delivered. Clear, direct, public. Vanessa's cheeks colored slightly. For the first time, she looked less like a socialite and more like someone losing control of a situation she thought she owned. I came here out of respect, she replied. Then show some. The words landed with surprising force. I saw several guests exchange glances. The conversation was no longer entertainment. It was becoming a warning. I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the kitchen and spend the rest of the night polishing silverware. Unfortunately, fate seemed to have other plans. One of the waiters approached carrying a tray of champagne. As he moved through the crowd, a guest accidentally stepped backward into his path. The tray tilted. Several glasses shifted dangerously. Without thinking, I moved forward to help steady it. The disaster was avoided, but the movement brought me directly between Vanessa and Margaret. For one brief second, all three of us stood facing one another. Close enough to feel the tension. Close enough to see every expression. Vanessa's gaze settled on me. You always seem to be in the middle of everything tonight. I am sorry, I said automatically. Stop apologizing. The words surprised me. They had not come from Margaret. They had come from an older gentleman standing nearby. A judge, if I remembered correctly. He offered me a small smile. Accidents happen. Several guests nodded. Tiny gestures. Barely noticeable. Yet something shifted. Vanessa noticed it too. The room was no longer automatically siding with her. The attention she normally controlled had started drifting elsewhere. Toward Margaret. Toward me. Toward the uncomfortable truth everyone had witnessed. Her expression tightened. How touching, she said softly. The maid has become everyone's favorite cause. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Enough. Vanessa took another step forward. Why? Because the truth is inconvenient. The warmth vanished from the room. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether they should continue playing. Then the ballroom doors opened. Not dramatically, not loudly. Yet the reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped. Security personnel straightened. Several influential guests turned toward the entrance at once. I followed their gaze. Rain shimmered beyond the glass doors. A tall figure stepped inside, removing dark leather gloves as he crossed the threshold. The atmosphere changed instantly. I had never met Alexander Moretti before, but the moment he entered the room, I understood exactly why nobody needed an introduction. Some men entered a room and attracted attention. Alexander Moretti entered a room and seemed to take ownership of the air itself. The moment he stepped inside, conversations dissolved into silence. Not because anyone told them to stop, because they did. He moved through the ballroom with calm, measured steps, rainwater still glistening faintly on the shoulders of his dark coat. He looked younger than I expected. Early 30s, maybe. Tall. Composed. The kind of man who never appeared rushed, even when everyone else was. Security personnel subtly repositioned themselves as he passed. Influential guests nodded respectfully. Some lowered their eyes altogether. I had spent 6 months working in the Moretti estate and had heard countless stories about Alexander. Business titan, philanthropist, private investor, the man newspapers photographed, besides senators and billionaires. Yet none of those descriptions explained the feeling that settled over the room when he arrived. It was not fear exactly. It was certainty. The certainty that he noticed everything. Alexander's gaze swept across the ballroom once. Just once. Somehow it felt like he had already absorbed every detail. Margaret smiled warmly. "You are late." "Traffic," he replied. A few guests laughed politely. Even his mother rolled her eyes. "In Manhattan?" It sounded believable. The tension eased slightly. Only slightly. Alexander kissed his mother's cheek before accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. Then his attention shifted. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But I noticed it. His eyes moved toward Vanessa. Then toward me. Then back to Vanessa. A small frown appeared. Gone almost immediately. Yet I had the uncomfortable feeling he already knew something had happened. Vanessa recovered first. "Alexander." Her voice brightened instantly. "We were just discussing your foundation." "Were you?" His tone remained polite. "Of course." She smiled. A very lively discussion. Alexander glanced towards several nearby guests. Nobody seemed eager to confirm that statement. "I see." The response carried no emotion. Somehow that felt worse. Vanessa continued anyway. "Your mother and I simply disagreed about a few things." Margaret lifted an eyebrow. "That is one way to describe it." Alexander looked between them. "Should I be concerned?" "Not at all," Vanessa answered quickly. "Everything is perfectly fine." I lowered my eyes and reached for an empty tray, hoping to escape before anyone remembered I existed. Unfortunately, that was when Alexander spoke again. "You." My stomach immediately tightened. I looked up. "Sir." His attention settled on me fully for the first time. Green eyes. Sharp. Observant. Not cold. Just impossible to fool. "You work here?" "Yes, sir." "Emily Carter." I blinked. "You know my name?" "You have worked for my family for 6 months." He took a sip of water. "I try to know the people who help run my home." I had no idea how to respond. Nobody had ever said anything like that before. Around us, several guests seemed equally surprised. Alexander's gaze lingered for another second. Then he looked toward his mother. What happened? The ballroom became silent again. Not a gradual silence. An immediate one. Every person present knew the question mattered. Margaret opened her mouth. Vanessa spoke first. "Nothing important." Alexander never looked away from her. "That was not directed at you." And suddenly, for the first time all evening, Vanessa Whitmore looked uncertain. The uncertainty on Vanessa's face lasted less than a second. Most people probably missed it. Alexander did not. Neither did I. He stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly against his glass, waiting, not demanding, not repeating the question. Somehow that made the silence heavier. Margaret finally sighed. "It was nothing worth disrupting your evening over." "Mother." The single word carried gentle warning. Margaret smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn." I learned from an expert. A few guests laughed nervously. The tension eased for a moment. Then Alexander looked toward me again. "Emily." My heart immediately sped up. "Yes, sir." "Tell me what happened." Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward me. I wanted the marble floor to open and swallow me whole. Public speaking had never been my strength. Public speaking in front of Manhattan's most powerful people felt impossible. "It was a misunderstanding," I said carefully. "Miss Whitmore asked me to clean her shoe. Mrs. Moretti disagreed. That is all." Alexander studied my face for several seconds. "That is all." "Yes, sir." He seemed unconvinced. Not because I was lying exactly. Because I was leaving things out. Vanessa recovered enough to smile. "See? No problem at all." Alexander turned toward her. "Then why does everyone in this room look uncomfortable?" Nobody answered. A crystal chandelier reflected hundreds of tiny lights across the ballroom ceiling. Somewhere near the orchestra, a violinist quietly adjusted sheet music. The ordinary sounds felt strangely loud. Vanessa folded her arms. "People are being dramatic." "Perhaps." Alexander glanced towards several longtime family friends. A retired judge, a senator, two business leaders. None of them seemed eager to support her version of events. The silence became its own answer. Margaret stepped forward before the situation could escalate further. Alexander, leave it alone. The gala is about charity, not arguments. He looked at his mother. His expression softened immediately. If that is what you want, it is. Then it is settled. Relief washed through me so suddenly that my knees nearly weakened. It was over. The evening could finally move on. Guests slowly resumed conversations. Music returned. Servers continued circulating through the ballroom. The storm had passed, or so I thought. 10 minutes later, I was carrying a fresh tray of sparkling water through the East Wing reception area when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and nearly dropped the tray again. Alexander Moretti stood there alone. No security, no assistance, just him. Sorry, I blurted out. I did not see you. You apologize more than anyone I have ever met. Heat rushed into my cheeks. Occupational hazard. To my surprise, one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile. Close. My mother likes you. I blinked. She is very kind. She is selective. He glanced toward the ballroom entrance where Margaret was speaking with donors. If she defended you publicly, there was a reason. I looked down at the tray. I do not think I did anything special. That may be the reason. Before I could figure out what that meant, a member of security approached quickly from down the hallway. The man's expression was controlled, professional, yet something about it immediately changed Alexander's demeanor. Sir, the guard said quietly, there is an issue involving the Whitmore family. Alexander's eyes hardened slightly. What kind of issue? The guard leaned closer and whispered something I could not hear. Whatever it was, the warmth disappeared from Alexander's face entirely. The change was subtle. Most people would not have noticed it. I did. 1 second Alexander stood beside me looking almost approachable. The next, every trace of warmth disappeared behind a wall of absolute control. He listened without interrupting as the security officer finished speaking. Then he nodded. Once. Thank you. The guard stepped away immediately. I should have returned to work. Instead, curiosity rooted me to the spot. Is everything okay? The question escaped before I could stop it. Alexander looked at me for a moment. I expected him to ignore it. Instead, he surprised me again. That depends on your definition of okay. That sounds concerning. It usually is. Despite the seriousness of his expression, there was a hint of dry humor beneath the words. Before I could respond, another guest approached him. Then another. Within seconds, he was pulled back into conversations about investments, charitable projects, and political fundraising. I slipped away toward the ballroom. Yet something felt different now. The atmosphere had changed. Guests were smiling. Music played. Champagne flowed. On the surface, the gala looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Beneath that surface, tension moved quietly through the room like an invisible current. I noticed clusters of people whispering together. Security personnel checking phones more frequently. Several investors leaving conversations midway through. Nobody explained anything. Nobody needed to. Important people always seemed to know things before everyone else. About 30 minutes later, I was arranging dessert plates near the grand staircase when I saw Vanessa again. She stood with her father, Richard Whitmore, near the center of the ballroom. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then I noticed Richard's expression. He looked distracted, agitated. His phone kept vibrating. Each time he checked it, the color drained slightly from his face. Vanessa seemed equally unsettled. Gone was the confidence she had displayed earlier. She forced smiles that never quite reached her eyes. More importantly, people had started avoiding them. Not openly, not rudely, just enough to be noticeable. A hedge fund manager who had been speaking with Richard suddenly excused himself. 2 board members drifted toward another conversation. Even a longtime donor quietly crossed the room after spotting the Whitmores approaching. The social shift was impossible to ignore. Emily. I turned. Margaret Moretti stood beside me, holding a cup of tea. Mrs. Moretti, walk with me. We moved toward a quieter hallway overlooking the estate gardens. Rain streaked softly against the tall windows. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Margaret sighed. You look worried. I am trying not to be. A reasonable goal. I hesitated. Something is happening tonight, isn't it? Margaret stared out into the darkness beyond the glass. Actions have consequences, child. Does this have something to do with Vanessa? Margaret glanced at me. Why do you ask? Because everyone seems afraid to stand near her. A faint smile touched her lips. People are rarely afraid of the truth. They are afraid of being associated with it. Before I could ask what that meant, voices echoed from the ballroom entrance. Raised voices. Not angry. Shocked. Surprised. Margaret and I exchanged a look. Then we headed back toward the ballroom together. The moment we entered, I knew something major had happened. Hundreds of conversations had collapsed into one stunned silence. Every guest was staring toward the massive screen normally used to display charitable donations. And standing beneath that screen, holding a phone in trembling hands, was Richard Whitmore. The giant screen at the front of the ballroom was supposed to display donation totals. Instead, it showed a breaking financial report. I could not see every detail from where I stood, but I saw enough. A major banking institution had suspended several projects connected to Whitmore Holdings. Headlines scrolled across the screen. Investors were withdrawing. Partnerships were being reviewed. Regulatory audits had been announced. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Richard Whitmore stared at the screen as though it were written in another language. Vanessa looked even worse. Her confidence had vanished completely. She kept checking her phone, reading message after message with growing disbelief. Around them, people began stepping back. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just enough to create distance. The effect was impossible to miss. 5 feet became 10. 10 became 20. Within moments, the Whitmores seemed stranded in the middle of a ballroom filled with people who suddenly had somewhere else to be. What happened? I whispered. Margaret stood beside me, her expression unreadable. Consequences, she replied softly. Across the room, a board member approached Richard. For a moment, hope appeared in the older man's eyes. Then the board member quietly handed him an envelope and walked away. Richard opened it. His shoulders visibly sagged. Another phone call arrived. Then another. Each seemed worse than the last. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely. Nobody wanted to interrupt the unfolding spectacle. My attention drifted toward Alexander. He stood near one of the marble columns, speaking calmly with 2 foundation directors. Unlike everyone else, he appeared completely unsurprised. Not pleased. Not angry. Simply unsurprised. As though he had expected every second of this evening long before it happened. Vanessa finally marched across the ballroom toward him. Guests immediately turned to watch. Did you do this? She demanded. Alexander looked up from his conversation. Do what? Do not play games with me. Her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. Everything started tonight. Alexander regarded her quietly. Everything started long before tonight. Vanessa stopped. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to find a response. You think this is funny? She asked. No, his answer came immediately. I think choices matter. Silence followed. Alexander's gaze never left hers. Every person in this room is responsible for their own decisions. He glanced briefly toward his mother. Some people remember that. Some do not. Vanessa's expression shifted from anger to realization. Not complete realization. Just enough. Enough to understand that nobody was coming to rescue her from the consequences gathering around her family. She looked toward the guests who had once surrounded her. Nobody met her eyes. One by one, conversations resumed elsewhere. Doors quietly closed. Opportunities disappeared. Reputations changed. The ballroom had become a living lesson in power. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that never needed to announce itself. I watched Vanessa step backward. Then another step. For the first time since I had met her, she looked small, human, uncertain. And standing there beneath the crystal chandeliers, I suddenly understood something important. The most powerful person in the room was not the one speaking the loudest. It was the one who never had to raise his voice at all. The gala ended less than an hour later, but nobody talked about the donations on the drive home. Nobody talked about the orchestra, the speeches, or the record-breaking fundraising numbers. They talked about the Whitmores. They talked about consequences. They talked about power. As for me, I spent the rest of the evening clearing tables and collecting empty glasses while trying to make sense of everything I had witnessed. By midnight, most of the guests had gone home. Rain still drifted across the estate windows in silver streaks. The mansion felt quieter now, smaller somehow. I was carrying a box of unused programs toward a storage room when I heard footsteps behind me. Long night. Alexander's voice made me jump. I nearly dropped the box. You really need to stop doing that. To my surprise, he laughed softly. Doing what? Appearing out of nowhere. I walked down a hallway. Very quietly. Another faint smile appeared. I was beginning to realize those smiles were rare. Let me help. Before I could protest, he lifted the box from my hands as though it weighed nothing. You do not have to do that. I know. The answer caught me off guard. We walked in silence for a few moments. The mansion seemed completely different without hundreds of guests inside it. More like a home, less like a kingdom. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to ask the question that had been bothering me all evening. Did you know what was going to happen? Alexander glanced at me. Which part? The Whitmores. His expression became thoughtful. I knew certain truths would eventually become public. Tonight, perhaps. We reached the storage room. He set the box down carefully. Truth has a habit of arriving on its own schedule. The answer sounded frustratingly vague. Yet somehow I believed him. People think you planned everything. People think many things. He looked toward the rain-covered windows at the end of the hallway. Most of them are wrong. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his attention returned to me. My mother told me what happened earlier. My stomach tightened instantly. It was not a big deal. You stood beside her when nobody else did. Anyone would have done the same. No, his response came immediately. Calm. Certain. Not everyone. I looked away first. Something about the sincerity in his voice made me uncomfortable. Not because it felt false. Because it felt genuine. I only did what seemed right. That is usually the hardest thing to do. Silence settled between us again. Comfortable this time. Unexpectedly comfortable. Finally, Margaret appeared at the far end of the hallway carrying a cup of tea. There you both are. She smiled warmly. I was beginning to think my son had kidnapped my favorite employee, Mrs. Moretti. I laughed despite myself. Alexander looked mildly offended. Favorite? Do not be jealous. Margaret slipped her arm through mine. It is not attractive. For the first time all night, the tension completely disappeared. We stood there laughing quietly while rain tapped against the windows and the last of the gala lights dimmed throughout the estate. Looking back now, that was the moment everything truly changed. Not when the ballroom fell silent. Not when powerful people lost influence. Not when fortune shifted. It happened in that quiet hallway. Because that was the moment I stopped seeing Alexander Moretti as the most powerful man in New York and started seeing him as a man. One whose life was about to become connected to mine in ways neither of us could possibly imagine.